Well, hello, friend. Welcome to another episode of Artworks for Teachers. I'm your host, Susan Riley, and today we are being joined by Theo Edmonds. Now, Theo is what is called a cultural futurist, which is such a wonderful, intriguing kind of career. And he talks a lot about the convergence between creativity, the workforce as we know it, and all of the outside kind of components that go into both of those areas. And he has a whole new term called creative brain capital that we're going to get into in this episode. I think you're going to find this really fascinating all the way through. Something that is really important, though, about this conversation is that while Theo talks a lot about what's happening in the world and what's coming, for us as educators to take this and learn from what is coming and know how we can then use this to impact how we're teaching and why it is that we're embedding creativity so heavily into our curricula. So without further ado, here's Theo. Well, welcome, Theo. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself to get started, specifically what a culture futurist is?
So I think a lot of folks have a misunderstanding about futurist. And so first we could maybe start with clearing that up, and then we can add the culture piece to it. First of all, also thank you for having me on today. I'm very excited about the conversation. And as a board member at Americans for the Arts and a lifelong artist and poet myself, arts education is something that is very near and dear to my heart. And also doing what I can to support the evolution. It is undergoing,
Yes.
and will continue to go under. And we can get into that a little bit in the futurist part.
Yeah.
A futurist is not someone who predicts the future. What I essentially do is I answer three questions. And so when you're thinking about a decision to be made, a strategic direction, where do we play?
Mm-hmm.
What does it take to play wisely?
Mm-hmm.
And what do we need to stay resilient and curious when the unexpected does happen?
Mm-hmm.
Because it always will. And so those are the three questions that I kind of center on. And, I grew up, I'm neurodiverse, and I grew up part of the LGBT community, and I grew up in a 9th-generation Appalachian family. So I learned how to navigate systems that were not necessarily designed with me in mind.
Yes.
All the time I was growing up, and what I now have some $25 words for, I now know that I was cultivating a pretty deep skill set in pattern recognition and strategic foresight. So I learned how to, understand kind of cognitively where people are, and in any room I was going into. I learned to understand how the emotional creative tension, if you will, of a room was open or not open to whatever it might be that I would be introducing into it. And then I also learned how to, cultivate the skills for navigating multiple directions I might need to go. Skip to 2024, we now know that those skills, pattern recognition, strategic foresight, analytical combined with creative thinking, self-awareness, resilience, curiosity, these are among the World Economic Forum's top future of work job skills.
Yes.
And so, if you're fortunate enough to live long enough, you get to play a lot of roles and a lot of parts. And I feel like where I'm at now is probably the most aligned where my particular skill set has been with kind of the culture moment at hand. And so the culture part of Culture Futurist is really signaling context. And, we often think about, especially in higher education or in the research world, we like these kind of, nicely, tightly laboratory controlled conditions for experiments and so forth, but life doesn't always work like that. And so cultural context matters. And so when you think about data, what I look for is what are the culture signals that are in data that I can then stack on top of each other. And that maybe in the normal kind of, most people wouldn't think about stacking these particular data sets on top of each other to understand something. But if I do that, those culture signals, and I find that thread that I start to pull, all of a sudden, all those data points start collapsing down into something that looks more like infinite present moment of multiple possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the activity that I'm engaging in. So what is a culture signal? What are those culture signals? Loneliness is a culture signal I'm looking at right now. I think, we can talk about loneliness as like the Surgeon General does, as a health crisis, as a mental health driver.
Yeah.
But honestly, I think loneliness, maybe more than any other thing, beyond its health implications, is a signal that we are in a systems change, and the new system has not quite yet come to fruition yet. We don't know what that looks like. And all of us have connected our identities to this kind of old system that seems to be breaking down. And so, we know for example, from psychological research from Erickson and Marcia are two researchers I look at how identity gets formed. We know that about individuals, but, I think that same thing happens in teams, in groups, in nations.
Yeah.
So we can talk about the micro, meso, or macro level. So what identity are we holding on to now? And how is it connected to a system that maybe we're just becoming aware that it has not getting ready to go through a change, but is firmly in going through a change. And like when people struggle with identity, a lot of things happen with that. And so the cultural signals I look at are things like systems change and how loneliness is an indicator maybe of an identity attachment that we've not been able to kind of quite latch onto yet of the next thing that is coming.
Yeah.
And, I've taught more, I've developed a method called quantum storytelling that kind of looks at any decision within the context of essentially quantum physics, multiple possibilities, where you put your attention manifest for the outcome that you're going to see. But even in that decision for a new product, a new idea, a new service, there's ancestral wisdom that's there.
Yes.
And in that action you take, you're writing future history. But if we go beyond that linear construct and think about the infinity loop of it, it just helps to locate where we are in something. And if we can locate ourselves, then we're on our way to asking better questions.
This is completely fascinating to me because, and I'm seeing some of these images in my head of the idea of you're drawing upon your own skill set, your own empathy to try to look at some of these data points. And for me, like when you walk into a room, it's kind of like you can see the people in the room, you can adjust and see who's there and what's needed. But you're doing this on such a large scale. How do you decide what data points to look at and where and how to kind of measure that without actually being with the people in real time?
So there's a few questions that were packed into there. Let me kind of tease those out a little bit so I'm answering the right one. So I think all of us, before we even had kind of language, I think it's encoded in our brain from the time we were born. Even before we have language as children, once we're aware of ourselves as an independent sentient being that has these are my hands. You go into a room where there's other people. There's three questions. The first one is, am I safe? Depending on how you answer that question for yourself, you move to the second question, and that is, I believe, how am I connected to these people in this room? Depending on how you answer that, you then go into the next level. So if I'm safe and I can understand how I'm connected, the third question I think we all kind of ask is, in what way does the things that I see and need and want, etc., human desire for my future, depend upon my contribution to the thing this group is trying to do together? And so what we're doing there, I think, is trying to understand the internal and external synchronization of our experience in moving through the world. And so that first question about like, how do you put these skills together and know where they come from? So in some ways, I'm doing something that is incredibly common to the human experience. how do you know what to measure? How do you account for other people? I think if you have kind of if you recognize that all of us are bringing those kinds of questions into the room,
Yes.
I think you would, you would have to be seriously checked out to believe that your own boundary conditions, your own view of the world is the limits of the rest of the world. I think it was Schopenhauer, if I'm getting my philosophers right, talked about how that we often conflate that our own limitations based on our own experience as if they are the limitations of the world.
Mm.
And that's just not true. I was just down at the Fast Company Innovation Festival, uh, got to listen to this amazing hour-long presentation conversation by Lin-Manuel Miranda. He was talking about the question he was asked was, how did like are you a historian, and like because of Hamilton, and he's like no, I'm not a historian at all. In fact, I started doing the beginnings of Hamilton before I actually knew anything about him, because the question I started with was, here's this person that we've all maybe heard the name thrown around, that if we're being honest, most of us don't know the first thing about, but still to this day seems to have this larger than life impact on our modern day lives. And I'm curious about that.
Yes.
And so it was that curiosity that drove the inquiry into, why don't I know more about this person? What will I find out if I find out more about this person? How do I kind of not judge this person from 200 years ago for the things they did through a present day lens? And so that idea around, the self-awareness, the curiosity, and by curiosity, I just don't mean like I'm curious about this guy, Hamilton, right?
Yeah.
What he was really saying is, I'm curious, and that's what allows me to stay open long enough to hold creative tension, where I don't feel like I got to start solving for the creative tension.
Yes.
And I can stay open enough and comfortable within that creative tension to let myself find some different questions in that space. When we can get ourselves in that kind of mindset, then interesting things can happen, because we're never going to know, like my work today with Creativity America, which I'll share a little bit later, is focused on teams. Like we conflate in popular culture creativity as to just an individual activity. Nothing really gets done unless we partner up with somebody else and a bunch of somebody else's in order to do something together. I think that is this false story that we've told ourselves in the United States, that, and it's baked into kind of the value proposition, if you will, of the U.S. of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, individualism, all super important. But the idea of genius being just this exceptional individual and nobody else in the world like him, and then Einstein or Steve Jobs, etc. Well, the thing is, you don't have to scratch too hard to realize that nobody would have known who either one of those people were if they had connected their ideas into networks of people who could share their story and that could help them. So this idea of genius, rather than being the virtue of a individual, the way I think about genius is it's a cultural outcome. It's a cultural outcome of a group of people who successfully sit within creative tension long enough to get to some deeper questions. And I think for me that feels a lot more to the origin of genius, which the origin of that word is the protective spirit of a person or a place.
Yeah.
And if nothing else, I think we are each other's protective spirits because we have to do things together.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're so right in that, in so many things. Like there are so many kind of little nuggets that you just drop throughout there. This idea of having that curiosity and how it opens to this creative tension. I think we're so focused on problem solving and making sure we get to the answer, particularly when we're talking about education, that we don't leave the time, or the space to allow for there not to necessarily be an answer, to allow there to be this space for innovation, if you will. So I would love for you to tell us more about Creativity America, because I know that is a huge initiative that's working right now specifically to boost creativity skills across the country. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, sure. I'm excited to share it with you. And you all are actually hearing about some of the, we've just started beginning to roll things out a little bit just in the last month or so. So with Creativity America, it is a America in that word is signaling a cultural context.
Mhm.
And so why is that important? It's not saying that America has got it figured out and the rest of the world should follow us. But it is saying that America is a context. And so if you think about something like some of your listeners of yours may be familiar with like arts prescribing. It's a big topic these days.
Yeah.
A lot of that research comes from the United Kingdom. And for 30, 40 years, they've been doing social prescribing based in community, so they've got a lot of experience with it. But I think even more importantly, the UK, the EU has made different social agreements
Mm.
than we have made in the US.
Yes.
They We have commodified healthcare and we've commodified education here, unlike the social agreement that those are something that looks more like a human right that everybody has access to in these other places where a lot of this idea of arts prescribing, social prescribing comes out of. And so it's a great idea, but when you translate it into the American context, the commodification of healthcare and education shape differently what people perceive to be possible and valuable.
Mm.
And so different value equations get kind of put around any new idea that gets introduced. And so Creativity America is really signaling a cultural context of the U.S., the stories we tell about what the origin stories of America are, who we are yesterday, who we're going to be, etc. And with Creativity America, we talk about it in terms of the wonder economy.
Mm.
So that word innovation gets thrown around quite a lot, and we often in today's world can conflate it with some notion of technology or some future of work strategy, and both of those things super important, but there's a human side to both of those things. And so the wonder economy is not saying that those things don't matter. It's saying, what is the human side?
Mhm.
How do we become more deeply human
Yes.
at this time
Yes.
in order to thrive alongside future of work demands
Mhm.
and technology that is emerging? And so the wonder economy is simply kind of like it's the human side of technology in the future of work. And we talk about creativity as being currency in that economy, and that's actually quite literal.
Mhm.
So Creativity America is on a mission to weave the arts and science of creativity into mainstream business innovation.
Mhm.
When we talk about weaving that into mainstream innovation, why is that important? It's important because 8 out of 10 Americans work in the private sector.
Mhm.
And we often, I think, in the arts can conflate private sectors if we're only talking about these kind of big multinational corporates.
Yes.
But indeed, it's solopreneurs and mom and pop shops in communities all the way up to these multinationals. And that's where 8 out of 10 of us in America are putting food on our table and clothes on our back. So to think about systems change, we have to be in the cultural context that are kind of governing and shaping the way most people understand their lives
Mhm.
and navigate their lives. Now we can talk about if those are the right systems or not, but that's a different conversation. I'm taking a very practical approach with Creativity
Yep.
America. And so I definitely also believe that with the private sector that we have been in an unhealthy relationship with them between the arts
Yeah.
and the private sector for a very long time. It's been mostly transactional,
Mhm.
that we are recipients in the arts of their funding, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
That's all valuable. However, the question that I ask is, what's beyond that transactional
Mhm.
relationship? What are the transformational relationships that could be built?
Yes.
And so that's what we're trying to kind of go into with Creativity America in a very practical, data driven kind of way. And so we bring together arts, science, mostly brain science, and business. And the brain sciences we're talking about depend upon not just cognitive neuroscience of creativity in the brain, but also those team level, group level, industrial, organizational, behavioral, social psychology in companies aspects of how the brain works. And so if you think about creativity as currency, we call it creative brain capital. And that is we've developed a methodology for quantifying the creative brain skills that the World Economic Forum says everybody's got to have in the future of work. And those are analytical and creative thinking, self-awareness and resilience, curiosity and emotional intelligence. And importantly for me, it's storytelling. Storytelling that actually moves markets. When we talk about storytelling, data is a story that we tell, right? Narratives, our personal narratives, our marketing and companies, the way we, create movies that gets people interested in going into this industry or that industry as a career. We're telling stories all the time. And if you think about kind of what operates on the workforce, we talk coming out of my public health kind of background, talk about social ecological models, and probably a lot of your viewers are very familiar with those. Yeah. It's the idea, that individual is something more than just the sum of those parts. Even like Columbia researchers, talk about like how something like spirituality is encoded in our DNA, not religiosity, but just like we're born with an understanding that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. And that, the spirituality piece of this is super important. And we don't talk nearly enough about that, but so the individual. Within that individual is part of communities, and those communities are part of cities and industries, and you just keep on going up. But you also have the multiple intelligences of the animal world, our natural world. Yes. The James Webb Space Telescope, these images that it is coming back with, I see the next one of those. Every time a new image comes across, it's the only time I can think of on social media where people just kind of, for a nanosecond, just let their stuff down.
Yeah.
It's just collective. Whoa.
It's collective awe, right? Yes.
It is because in that moment, there is something in psychology, the hypnopompic or hypnagogic state of when you're going into dreaming and coming out of dreaming. And it's just that liminal space where it's kind of more like melancholy maybe than anything, where you're not awake yet. Yes. So there's an anticipation of what's happening, and you're not still fully dreaming. So there's maybe even a melancholy, there's maybe a longing for that state that you were in. And so in that moment, really interesting things get born in our mind. And these images, I think, are similar to that when one comes across. And it makes sense because if you think about it hard enough, everything that a human has ever built, everything that we understand as a building, a city, a nation, contains two things that we have pulled from the earth and human imagination. Both of those were born in the heart of a dying star, and both of those things are quite literally stardust. So how is it that our human imagination and a tree are the same thing? That's because they come from the same materials. Yes. And so when you think about those levels, the personal, the community, the industries, yes, this idea from the individual to the cosmic is our way of understanding the world. Mm-hmm. And so with that orientation, though, you've got things that act upon workers. And these are things like social determinants of health, as we talk about sometimes, right? So socioeconomic status, your identity based upon economic systems, yes, where you live, where you grow. So all of these things that we talk about as social determinants of health act upon workers and having a big impact. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has we've got to all give them the credit for really helping us to fully appreciate and understand that your zip code determines your life expectancy, yes, more than your genetics. Yes. So things acting upon workers. But then you have the things that manifest within workers. And those are things like neurodynamic processes. And so when you think about loss, I'm more and more convinced that that unprocessed grief in our nation is our biggest innovation as well as biggest national challenge. And what I mean when I say that is, if you dig into how the brain uses loss, you see that there is a process in place called neurodynamic processes, that if the brain loses something, a loved one, a dream. Innovation is yes, it's something new, but something is going to have to be given up often for innovation to happen. So
Yes.
we're not understanding the loss of a new idea that's going to have to be that people will have to go through. We're not really working with the whole picture. We focus, I think, we talk about solutions, and we have historically rewarded confidence in solutions, not vulnerability, and I might not have the right question. And so these aerodynamic processes, if we don't engage them effectively, allostatic load becomes allostatic overload. It becomes inflammation, and we understand this in epigenetics with generational trauma. We understand this in heart disease and some forms of cancer. So it's a powerful process. So the things manifesting within workers, things acting on workers, the social determinants of health, those kinds of things, things manifesting within workers. And I would add to that, like around loss and grief and neurodynamic processes and allostatic overload. I would also add in there the things that our sacred traditions have been talking about for a very long time.
Yes.
The five poison Buddhas: attachment, envy, anger, pride, ignorance. These are some of the top topics that brain research and psychology is really, investigating heavily these days to understand how these work in our societies. But these have been around with us for a very, very long time. These are basic human things. So manifesting within, acting upon workers. But then I am coming to believe that there's something more powerful than any other thing that shapes what people in the workforce, people in industries see as possible and valuable. And that is the stories we tell about whatever it is.
Yes.
Our brains are hardwired to receive those stories and be shaped by them.
Yes.
And those storytelling determinants of kind of our creative brain capital happens on an individual level, but then it happens even more at, organizational levels or national level. You can see it in our national politics right now.
Yeah.
We don't have that new identity of that system that is forming, but it's not quite fully formed. So there's nothing to attach that identity to.
Yeah.
And so the stories that we're telling matter, and they matter greatly.
Yes.
And that's all fine and good. But I think one of the things we're trying to also do with Creativity America that I learned from the last 10 years with well-being research, we were a victim of our own success in the well-being research community. We convinced every CEO, every leader who was listening that well-being mattered. It mattered greatly. It was subjective, and one size does not fit all. We were successful in showing that data to them, to which almost no one I could think of in a leadership position said anything other than, "Oh my God, that's amazing. Here is this story that I have about myself and this well-being, fill in the topic. Here's a story I have about myself and my daughter, my child, and how we feel and how we're experiencing this topic." But if you're telling me, I believe you, that well-being not only matters, but it is also highly subjective. I manage and run teams of teams. I don't know how to do, if I'm running a team of 10 or 10,000, I don't know how to do individual strategies for every single one of those people.
Right.
And well-being is not why I'm being paid by our external stakeholders.
Yes.
I'm being paid to produce a return on investment for them. Again, back in Kentucky, we'd say this in bourbon conversation. We could have about this sometime. I'm just saying that is the practical realities of the way we have constructed our social agreements in the US.
Yeah. And well, I was going to say, and as much as you've shared that with well-being, I think that's also the conversation around creativity in the workforce.
It is.
Right?
And that's exactly where I'm going. Yeah. Well-being can't be the goal. It should be an input, though, because when we tried to make it the goal of well-being, what leaders did is they said, it's important, so I'm going to give it to our HR folks, and they're going to figure it out.
Yes.
Well, at that moment, one of HR does a lot of amazing and good things in the world, but risk mitigation is one of their primary roles. And HR is historically largely been seen as a cost center, not a growth center. So when we assigned well-being to that, or leaders assigned well-being to that, they assigned it as risk and they assigned it as cost. And so with Creativity America, we're trying to avoid that impulse to make creativity the thing, but to make creativity the brain skills framework World Economic Forum says everybody needs in order to drive business performance.
Yes.
right? In teams. And so the stories we tell around all of this, how move from the me to the we, how do you take brain science and sync it up with culture?
Mm-hmm.
How do you have create new innovation rituals and collaborations between brain scientists, both cognitive and behavioral, and artists who could help rewrite the biology culture dialogues that I think have stymied us from kind of seeing new ways to reimagine talent manage engagement, new ways to look at leadership development, business strategy, social impact. Because I think especially with the arts, kind of singularly, at best, I think we have made some inroads on the design front.
Yeah.
But artists are so much more than
Yes.
that. And I say that as an artist, we're amazing strategists.
Yes.
We can do things in ways that while are not unique from a creative mechanism standpoint, because creativity is not the sole province of the arts, neither is culture.
Right.
Creativity and culture happen everywhere in society, but we do something very unique with it that is hard to replicate. And so all I'm suggesting with that is if we're able to kind of stabilize a relationship where the entrepreneur, the business leader, the brain scientist, the artist are able to enter in as equals to hold and sit in creative tension long enough to get to a better question, a question being a story that we're going to tell, what can happen on the other side of that. And I think the big innovation here is the way we have developed something called the Creative Brain Capital Index. And so one of the things that around that, you've got to be able to quantify something in order to show a causal relationship to the outcome, the return on investment of a company, right? Mm-hmm. So Creative Brain Capital does that. So when I talk about the wonder economy, creativity is currency, this is what I'm talking about. So Creative Brain Capital there's three legs to that stool. One is the creative potential of a group, and we can measure that. That is the province of our cognitive neuroscientists who are doing amazing work, in this field. So we can measure the creative potential of a group by using those cognitive measures. Okay. But then the second thing you have to be able to measure is the creative motivation of a group. Is this group motivated to work together to unlock that potential? In that second vector of measurement, the creative motivation vector, we get there through four kind of spectrums. We measure a spectrum we call wonder, which is a quantitative assessment of awe to curiosity. A trust spectrum, which is a measure of hope to belonging and mattering. A freedom spectrum, which is a measure of compassion to courage. And a joy spectrum, which is a measurement of hedonic to eudaimonic well-being, or happiness to purpose. And it's through that kind of those kind of four spectrums of measurement we're able to quantify, this group is motivated to work together to this degree to unlock that potential. Then the third vector we measure is if motivation and potential are there, does this group actually have the skills that research shows are required in order to turn motivation and potential into new enterprise value? And that's a set of creative collaboration assessment skills. And so you put all of that together and you get a pretty good idea where you can then start designing something that looks more like a precision intervention, kind of like how where we've got to with healthcare, with precision medicine. So to deliver the optimal intervention for a particular individual's biology, gut biome, all the things. So what if we are able to then have something like a Creative Brain Capital Index that we could use to do precision culture intervention to optimize the creative intelligence and performance of teams to drive who are being tasked with driving their organization or their company's growth.
Yeah, that's amazing. There is so much that you've embedded into this initiative, which I think is so critical to where we're going, because we speak to educators all the time. And one of the things that educators know is that building creativity into their curricula, into how they teach, into what they teach, and into the culture of how we teach, right, as schools, is important. It's more critical now than ever, but sometimes they don't quite understand why. We know that it's supposed to be in the workforce. It's part of the 21st century skills, but what you've shared, I think, helps us to understand where this is going and why it's so important. And you've talked a lot about story. We talk in our organization all the time about what story are you telling yourself about whatever it is, whatever situation it is. Before we close out, I would love to hear a story from you about how creativity has impacted a cross-disciplinary project for you and what might that look like.
So I could tell you many, just to stick with the vein that we're on. Creativity America is that for me.
Mhm.
I've had three different careers already in my life, and not jobs, careers.
Mhm.
I had a corporate health career. I had a career as a visual artist and a producer of theater between Europe and New York.
Mhm.
And then for the last 10 years, my husband and I co-founded an organization called Ideas X Lab. So that was in 2013. And the idea was to, is that what if question. What if you take a really interesting creative artist process and integrate them into other innovation teams? What becomes possible? So we were in 2013, 2014, we were putting incredible artists with great conceptual practices into innovation teams of Fortune 50 companies, not to make art. I knew art would happen. I'm an artist. Art always is going to happen.
Yes.
But it was to integrate that different type of creative mind into a team with other creative minds in service to that goal. And then the other side of that was to do the same thing in community innovation. Kind of,
Mm.
a lot of people talk about it as social entrepreneurship, community development. And so that was the third career. And then the last half of that third career has been, I got invited to be I'm an accidental academic. I got invited to join a faculty in School of Public Health at the University of Louisville. And so I've been, for the last 5 years, deep into National Science Foundation work that I've led as a principal investigator. And then for the last 3 or 4 years, been looking at, when we say creativity, what are all the disciplines you've actually got to have to have that? Because
Yeah.
the way the media tells the story, brain scans are really cool and easy to get somebody to click on in the media, because we all love to think about ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so, but again, that's all great, but it's not the full picture of creativity in teams, creativity management, creativity in arts education.
Yeah.
I was just working on something the other day, like trying to find creative thinking. What's the definition computational computing
Yeah.
uses? What's the definition arts educators use? What's the definition IO psychologists use? What's the definition? So like there's a lot of similarities, but there's also the places we miss each other. So it's a complex thing. But so I tell people that I'm entering into my fourth career that brings corporate healthcare, my experience as a working and showing artist, and a social innovator and pracademic, accidental academic, all together into something designed to actually make change in the world. Because one thing I'm clear on is that there's a lot of brilliant researchers, and there's a lot of brilliant research sitting inside of higher education. I don't believe a lot of it's getting out and being applied in the world, because there's a system of risk and reward
Yes.
for professional assistant professor, associate professor, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
That keeps people in place to reinforce their own discipline.
Right.
And that's important. That depth is important, but that can't be all we're doing. There's got to be, we talk about interdisciplinary, we talk about transdisciplinary. And I think everybody who talks about that is intellectually honest in their wanting to do it, but the risk and rewards prevent that from happening. And so what is this third space that brings kind of knowledge of how things get done kind of in the private sector? What is the knowledge of that space that brings things from the arts world? And then what is the space of kind of academics, big philanthropy, social, the way we fund social entrepreneurship, social innovation? How do you bring those three things together to create a third space where arts, science, and business are released from the things that hold things in circles and incrementalism in those other areas? Don't have it perfected yet, but it's an important thing for us to be working on to try to figure out how that does happen. So bringing all three understandings of those spaces together into a third space that we have parity in those
Mm-hmm.
relationships so that one is not in service to the other. I'm increasingly bothered by how we always immediately assume that the arts are in service to this telling the story of science
Yes.
rather than a reciprocal feedback loop.
Yes.
Because I get it, but I think we're missing some really important stuff there by not trying to think about those feedback loops differently.
Yes, and
And so,
you're speaking our language with arts integration, because that's exactly, we talk about this all
yeah,
the time. The difference between arts enhancement and arts integration is that in
yeah,
integration, one is not in service of the other, that you have to have both in order for things to actually work, if instead of arts enhancement where one is usually being served by the other.
that's right. And that's where you think about language.
Yeah.
That means also being able to begin crafting new language, creative brain capital.
Yes.
Oh, what is that? Well, we've talked about a term I've never quite liked, but it's what everybody understands, human capital for a long time in
Yeah.
the private sector.
Yeah.
So you're not actually asking a wholesale replacement of it for people just to forget everything you know. It's you're asking them to like put a Venn diagram around on some things they know and just operate in that space. And
Yeah.
and like that's a more realistic, I think, way to achieve some early wins over a shorter term together. We tend to start with like the really big hard stuff, right? And don't recognize that we have to get a lot of little small wins to have that social capital to get to the bigger stuff.
You got it. You got it. Well, this has been just a fascinating conversation all the way around, Theo. Thank you so much. If our listeners
Thank you,
would
Susan.
like to get in touch, what's the best way that they can stay connected with you?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways. I am LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram, but LinkedIn is for sure my go-to.
Wonderful.
And so there, and you could also get me at my own website, Theo Edmonds, and that's Edmonds with an O.com,
Wonderful.
or at creativityamerica.com. Not Creative America, creativityamerica.com.
All right. Well, we will put all of those in the show notes so that people can immediately go find you. Theo, thank you so much for this inspiring conversation and for the work that you're doing for the world. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Susan. And I come from a family of educators. So your audience is very, very near and dear to my heart.
Well, thank you.